At 89, the tragedy of Woody Allen is not the scandal the world argued about. It is the confession he never made until Diane Keaton was gone. He didn't break the silence with a press release or a grand televised eulogy. He broke it in small rooms to old friends, in halting sentences that tasted like regret. "I should have let her be," he told them. 56 years, 9 films, a love too messy to survive, too stubborn to die. When the call came on October 11, 2025, he reportedly said the quietest, most devastating line of his life, "I didn't even know she was sick." That absence more than any headline crushed him. They met in 1969. She walked in a California sunbeam in mismatched clothes, and he felt something he could never quite control. He tried anyway. He intellectualized, revised, directed, edited. She laughed, resisted, and stayed infuriatingly gloriously herself. He wrote Annie Hall as an exorcism and won her an Oscar. She gave him credibility, soul, and the illusion of closure. But the truth doesn't care for neat endings. When the industry turned its back, she didn't. 13 words, "Woody Allen is my friend and I continue to believe him," cost her roles, allies, and peace. She paid the price without sending him the bill. And now the man who controlled everything on screen admits he controlled the one thing he should have simply loved. A framed photograph from 1970. Laughter so real it aches. A letter written too late. If you're here for celebrity gossip, you'll miss the point. This isn't a scandal. It's a study in human failure, fierce loyalty, and the terrible math of regret. Stay with this story. Listen closely, because what Woody finally reveals after Diane's death does not rewrite Annie Hall, it unmasks it. But the darkest secret was yet to be revealed. Before there was scandal, before there was Annie Hall, there was a man and a woman, 2 artists who accidentally created one of the most enduring myths of modern cinema, the illusion that genius and love can coexist without destroying each other. Woody Allen and Diane Keaton were never a typical Hollywood couple. He was the neurotic intellectual from Brooklyn, forever trapped inside his own mind. She was the California dreamer, bright, impulsive, and joyfully chaotic. Together, they became something more than lovers. They became the living embodiment of an era when art and life blurred until no one could tell. When audiences saw them on screen, they didn't see characters. They saw chemistry raw, awkward, unfiltered. They saw themselves. Annie Hall Allen wasn't. Yet behind the curtain of artistic brilliance lay something far less cinematic. Allen's need for control wasn't just a creative habit, it was a survival mechanism. He built entire worlds to manage the chaos inside him. And Diane, she was chaos incarnate. Her refusal to conform, to be improved, to stop being herself, was both the reason he loved her and the reason he couldn't keep her. Friends who knew them then recall a strange electricity. She disarmed him simply by existing. He'd write 10 pages of dialogue to express a feeling. She'd destroy all 10 with a single offbeat comment that made him laugh in spite of himself. He found in her a mirror that didn't flatter but revealed. It terrified him. Their romance didn't last, but the connection did, transforming into something neither could name. Through 9 films and 56 years, they never stopped orbiting each other. When the rest of Hollywood turned away, she stayed, even when it cost her everything. And when she died, he realized what the rest of the world had quietly understood for years, that Diane Keaton wasn't just Woody Allen's muse. She was his moral compass, his conscience, and the truest thing he ever captured on film. In interviews long before her passing, Keaton would say, "I love Woody, always will, just not like that anymore." People thought it was nostalgia, but now, in the light of his private confessions, those words sound like prophecy. She had forgiven him for everything, long before he knew what he needed forgiveness for. Their story isn't about innocence or guilt. It's about 2 people who tried to love each other the only way they knew how, through creation, through obsession, through film. And maybe that's why her death hit him so hard, because when she left the world, a part of his own narrative, his better half, the one that made sense of the chaos, vanished too. The greatest irony, in trying to write the perfect love story, he accidentally lived one. Flawed, unbalanced, and unforgettable. And yet, this wasn't where their story began. To understand why her death shattered him so completely, we have to go back to the beginning to 1969, when a 23-year-old dreamer walked into a Broadway audition and changed the course of his life forever. Before fame sculpted them into icons, they were simply Annie and Alan, two souls shaped by loneliness, ambition, and the quiet ache of wanting to be seen. Their childhoods couldn't have been more different yet. Both would unknowingly prepare them for the strange collision that would define their lives. Woody Allen, born Alan Konigsberg in Brooklyn, New York, in 1935, was a boy who lived almost entirely inside his head. His family was Jewish, middle class, and emotionally distant. His father managed a jewelry business that failed more often than it succeeded. His mother, stern and unsmiling, worked long hours as a bookkeeper. There were no family dinners filled with warmth, no laughter echoing through the house, just the sharp clicks of a typewriter and the hum of the radio. As a child, Alan was clever but painfully shy. He devoured books, escaped into movies, and began writing jokes at 15, selling them to comedians to make extra money. He later said, half in jest and half in truth, comedy was my survival. It wasn't just a career, it was armor. Every punchline was a wall between him and a world that made him feel small. But beneath that humor lay a constant anxiety, the belief that nothing was ever enough, that love always came with conditions. It was this fear that would haunt every relationship he ever had, turning affection into analysis, intimacy into control. Across the country, Diane Hall, later known as Diane Keaton, was born in Los Angeles in 1946. Her world was sunlit and noisy, the opposite of Woody's gray Brooklyn. Her father was a real estate broker, her mother a homemaker, with artistic dreams she never fully pursued. The family was loving, but Diane always felt different. She was tall, awkward, and imaginative, often described as the girl who made everything dramatic. Where most children sought approval, Diane sought expression. She'd perform for anyone who'd listen, neighbors, relatives, even pets. Her mother encouraged her, often filming her skits on an old home camera. That encouragement planted the seed of a lifelong belief that performance was not about pretending, it was about revealing. She grew up idolizing Katharine Hepburn and Bette Davis, women who were unapologetically themselves. But what truly fascinated Diane wasn't their beauty or fame, it was their defiance. She once said, "They didn't seem to care what people thought." That was power. By the time she was a teenager, she'd already begun constructing her own persona, quirky, sincere, resistant to the idea of fitting in. At 19, she left college in California to pursue acting in New York City. It was a reckless move, no money, no plan, just faith and a suitcase. She worked as a waitress by day, auditioned by night, and lived in a tiny apartment that smelled of paint thinner and dreams. Her first break came in 1968 when she joined the original Broadway cast of Hair, a counterculture explosion of freedom and rebellion. Unlike most performers, Diane refused to perform nude in the show, a small act of resistance that said everything about who she was. She wasn't chasing shock value, she was chasing truth. And that truth brought her to the next year, 1969, when fate, or something like it, brought her into the orbit of a neurotic playwright named Woody Allen. By then, Allen had already built a reputation as the comic genius of New York's intellectual scene. His plays were smart, ironic, self-referential, the kind of humor that mocked his own insecurities before anyone else could. He was casting for his Broadway production, Play It Again, Sam, a romantic comedy about a man obsessed with Casablanca and incapable of real love. He'd seen dozens of actresses. None impressed him. Then Diane walked in, 23 years old, tall, wearing mismatched clothes that made her look like she'd gotten dressed in the dark. She spoke quickly, awkwardly, charmingly. Her audition wasn't polished, it was pure. Allen later said She was adorable, funny, and completely original. I knew instantly I had to cast her. I also knew instantly she would change everything. Their worlds couldn't have been more opposite, the guarded intellectual and the uninhibited dreamer. But that collision, the logical meeting, the unpredictable, sparked something that neither of them would ever recover from. Diane brought sunlight into Woody's gray world, and Woody gave structure to Diane's chaos. They were in a strange way mirror images of each other's missing halves, he the mind without warmth, she the heart without order. And from the moment they met, everyone who saw them together could sense it, that invisible current of curiosity, admiration, and danger, because Woody Allen, the man who built his entire life around control, had finally met the one person he could never control. And that was where the real story began, the rise, the fire, and the heartbreak that would follow. Because before fame immortalized them, love nearly consumed them. When Woody Allen cast Diane Keaton in Play It Again, Sam, he didn't just give her a role, he unknowingly opened a portal that would pull both their lives into the strange electric current of destiny. The play premiered in 1969 on Broadway, and from the first night, audiences were captivated by something no script could ever reproduce, the chemistry between its leads. He played Alan Felix, the anxious, overthinking romantic who worshipped Casablanca's Humphrey Bogart. She played Linda, the luminous, slightly offbeat woman who brought warmth to his neurosis. It was art, imitating life before either of them realized it. Every look, every hesitation, every half-smile felt real, because it was. In those years, New York was a crucible of creativity. The air was thick with revolution, art, politics, film identity, all colliding. The old Hollywood glamour was dying, replaced by something raw, introspective, and painfully human. Woody was already a darling of that new movement. Diane was just trying to survive it. She'd been living in a small apartment in the West Village, often skipping meals to afford acting classes. Woody, by contrast, was already earning headlines and Hollywood offers, yet he was lonely in a way that fame couldn't touch. She was light, he was shadow, and together they formed a kind of fragile balance neither had known before. During the show's run, they fell in love, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, in the quiet moments between rehearsals. She'd make him laugh when he didn't want to. He'd write lines just to hear her say them. Their romance, though, wasn't built on grand gestures. It was built on the strange intimacy of two people who felt safer on stage than in life. Friends who saw them together remember an odd tenderness. He was protective, attentive, sometimes even sweetly paternal. But beneath that care was something darker, a need to define her, to sculpt her into his idea of perfection. She was messy, spontaneous, intuitive. He was methodical, precise, terrified of unpredictability. For a while, Diane found his obsessiveness charming. It felt like attention, like being truly seen, but soon it became something else. Woody's affection could turn analytical. If she wore a loud outfit, he'd joke about it in front of friends. If she expressed emotion too freely, he'd tease her for being too Californian. His humor softened the criticism, but not the sting. Still, they stayed together. They worked, they loved, they fought quietly. Their friends doubted they'd last 6 months. They lasted nearly 3 years. Then came The Godfather. Francis Ford Coppola was casting a young woman for the role of Kay Adams, the moral center of Michael Corleone's world. Diane auditioned half-heartedly at a friend's insistence. Woody thought the film was a gangster picture beneath her, but she went anyway. When she got the part, everything changed. The film exploded into history. The Godfather wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural earthquake. Diane Keaton, at 26, went from stage actress to movie star overnight. And for Woody Allen, that was terrifying. Success had always been his domain. He had been the genius, the one in control. Now she was the face on posters, the name on critics' lips. The power dynamic shifted overnight, and he didn't handle it well. When she left New York for months to film, he went silent. When she returned radiant and transformed, he was colder. The gap between them had widened into something irreparable. They tried to fix it, working together again, in the film version of Play It Again, Sam, in 1972, but the magic had turned into something bittersweet. That same year, their romantic relationship ended. The breakup wasn't explosive, it was slow, painful, inevitable. She later said, "He wanted to make me better. I wanted to make him happy. Neither of us could." Yet, unlike most lovers, they didn't vanish from each other's lives. Instead, they did something stranger. They turned heartbreak into art. In 1977, Woody wrote Annie Hall. At first, it was meant to be a comedy about his own neurotic relationships, but as he wrote it, changed shape. It became their story, the real story, thinly disguised in fiction. He wrote the part for her, down to her clothes, her quirks, her laugh. Annie Hall's loose ties and wide-brimmed hats were Diane's own wardrobe. When she read the script, she didn't hesitate. She said yes. And in that yes was forgiveness, nostalgia, and maybe a quiet need to understand what they'd been. The film became a masterpiece. Annie Hall swept the Oscars, won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress. Woody's neurosis became art. Diane's authenticity became legend. But behind the applause was something only the two of them knew, that the film wasn't a celebration. It was a requiem. Woody had turned their love into a story he could control. He'd rewritten their ending into something gentle, philosophical, almost beautiful. But real love isn't cinematic, it's messy, unresolved, alive. And even as they stood together on Oscar night, smiling for the cameras, both knew the truth that what they had created on screen had already died off screen. Still, Annie Hall bound them forever. It was the ghost neither could exorcise, and that ghost would follow them through decades of creation, loyalty, and unspoken grief. Because in Hollywood, nothing haunts quite like the love that outlives the lovers. By 1977, the world no longer saw Woody Allen and Diane Keaton as two individuals. They saw a myth. Annie Hall had exploded into the cultural bloodstream like a quiet revolution. It wasn't just a love story, it was a mirror showing audiences the fragile absurdity of real human connection. For Woody, it cemented his genius. For Diane, it immortalized her as the face of modern romance, awkward, funny, brave, heartbreakingly real. She didn't just win the Oscar for Best Actress, she redefined what an actress could be. No longer the glamorous fantasy woman of the golden era, but something new, a woman who stammered, laughed too loud, dressed like herself, and didn't apologize for it. Her Annie Hall look, baggy trousers, men's vests, oversized hats, became a fashion movement. Ralph Lauren, who designed parts of her wardrobe, later admitted Diane didn't wear the clothes. The clothes became Diane. For Woody Allen, this was the summit. Annie Hall earned him Oscars for both direction and writing, making him Hollywood's most celebrated auteur of the decade. Critics called it the intellectual love story of the century. Audiences called it truth. But for the two people at its center, it was something stranger, a cinematic autopsy of a love they had already lost. Still, the film bonded them deeper than romance ever could. After Annie Hall, they became each other's constant reference point, the shared language of an emotional history that never really died. In interviews, Woody would call her the best actress I've ever worked with. Diane, when asked about him, would smile wistfully and say, "He's impossible, but he's brilliant." Those words said everything. The next decade saw both of them climb to staggering heights. Woody entered his golden age, Manhattan, 1979, Stardust Memories, 1980, Hannah and Her Sisters, 1986. His writing became sharper, more philosophical, more self-examining. Diane, too, evolved from ingenue to powerhouse. In Red's 1981, she held her own beside Warren Beatty. In Shoot the Moon, 1982, she bled emotion on screen like few actresses ever dared. But even as they worked separately, their paths were never far apart. Woody would write characters clearly, inspired by her fragile, funny, chaotic women who refused to conform. Diane, meanwhile, carried pieces of him in every role: his timing, his irony, his melancholy. Behind the scenes, though, their relationship remained a mystery to everyone else. Friends said they still spoke often. Others said they rarely did. One producer who worked with Allen in the 1980s recalled he'd bring her up constantly, then pretend he hadn't. When someone mentioned her name, his tone softened. The public image of the aloof intellectual faded for a moment, replaced by something more vulnerable, like a man still haunted by the one person who understood him. When Allen began his long professional partnership and eventual romantic entanglement with Mia Farrow, it seemed the Keaton era was over. But life has a cruel symmetry. Years later, when the Farrow-Allen relationship collapsed under the weight of public scandal, Diane would once again reappear like the ghost of his better days. In 1993, they reunited on screen for Manhattan Murder Mystery more than 20 years after their breakup. Time had aged them, but their chemistry hadn't faded. It had matured, deepened, grown tender. There was no pretense now, no attempt to rekindle what had once been. Just a quiet understanding that what bound them wasn't romance anymore, it was recognition. Watching them together again, critics said it felt like Annie Hall had grown up. The nervous energy had turned into warmth. The laughter, once defensive, now felt earned. And for a moment, audiences forgot the scandals, the years, the losses. They just saw two souls who had lived hurt and somehow found peace in each other's orbit. But peace in Hollywood never lasts long. By the 2000s, Woody's name was both revered and reviled. His work remained brilliant, but his private life overshadowed it. When new generations discovered Annie Hall, they also discovered the controversy that came with its creator. The industry that once crowned him a genius now turned cold, and through all of it, Diane Keaton stood apart, never condemning, never retreating, never rewriting her history. In one interview, she said simply, "He's been in my life since I was 23. He's part of who I am. I can't erase that, and I wouldn't want to." She didn't excuse him. She didn't defend him with logic. She defended him with loyalty, the kind that made no sense to anyone but her. For Woody Allen, who had built an entire career around words that silence, spoke louder than any speech he could have written. She didn't argue his case. She believed him, and that belief became her quiet rebellion against an industry that demanded she choose sides. By the mid-2010s, Diane's career had entered a graceful twilight. She was still working, still luminous, but less for the spotlight, more for the love of creation. Woody, now in his 80s, was a ghost of his former self in Hollywood, still directing, still writing, but increasingly isolated. Yet whenever he spoke of his past, he always returned to her. "She was the best thing that ever happened to me," he once told a journalist, "and I never deserved her." The tragedy wasn't that they broke up, it was that they never really stopped being a part of each other. Their art had bound them forever. Two flawed, brilliant souls immortalized in celluloid, trapped in the most beautiful heartbreak Hollywood ever filmed. But the real heartbreak wasn't on film. It was what happened decades later, when loyalty became isolation and love became defense. Every story that burns too brightly must one day cast a shadow, and the shadow in Woody Allen and Diane Keaton's story was darker than either of them could have imagined. It began quietly, whispers, rumors, accusations, echoes that grew louder as Hollywood's moral compass began to shift. When Dylan Farrow's allegations resurfaced in the 2010s, they didn't just shatter Woody Allen's career. They tore through the lives of everyone who had ever stood beside him. Overnight, the industry that once worshipped him turned cold. His name became a controversy, his films a moral question, and standing in the middle of the storm was Diane Keaton. She could have stepped back. Many did. Friends, collaborators, entire studios distanced themselves, but Diane didn't. In January 2018, she sent out 13 words that would change her life forever. "Woody Allen is my friend, and I continue to believe him." That single sentence detonated like a bomb. Within hours, headlines erupted. Social media flamed. Actors she'd mentored publicly condemned her. Activists called her loyalty disgusting. Her name trended next to his for all the wrong reasons. It would have been easy for her to release a statement, to clarify, to apologize. She didn't. When asked why she stayed silent, she said, "Because I said what I meant." For the first time in her career, the woman Hollywood had adored became its villain. She lost roles. Directors withdrew offers. Old friends stopped calling. The same press that once celebrated her individuality now branded her complicit. But those close to her saw something different. It wasn't blindness, it was conviction. She had known Woody Allen for more than 5 decades. She'd seen him in moments the world hadn't. His fragility, his guilt, his fear, his humor. And in her mind, the man she knew could not be the monster the headlines painted. She wasn't defending a director. She was defending a friend. Woody, for his part, never asked her to. He told friends later, "I didn't deserve that. She lost work because of me." But he also said something else, something that reveals the entire tragedy beneath their connection. "She believed in me the way I always wanted someone to, but I made it impossible to love me." As Hollywood exiled him, he withdrew further into his own small world, writing, directing, editing in silence. His later films were ignored, even by critics who once hailed him as a genius. But Diane never recanted. In a 2023 interview, her last major one before her death, she was asked if she regretted standing by him. She laughed softly, the same whimsical laugh that had once melted through Allen's cynicism, and said, "No, I'm proud. You have to stand by what you know. I'm too old to rewrite my own story." Then she said something that sparked immediate outrage. "You've got to get over it." That phrase, simple, unguarded, devastating, sealed her public fate. People who once idolized her turned away. Think pieces called her delusional. Awards committees stopped calling. The Academy, which had once crowned her, seemed to erase her name. But those who knew her best say the backlash didn't break her. It just made her quieter. By 2024, friends noticed she'd begun canceling appearances. She moved less, spoke less, and seemed to retreat into her home in Brentwood. She told no one she was sick, not her colleagues, not even Woody. Perhaps pride, perhaps privacy. Perhaps she didn't want to be pitied. And then came October 11th, 2025. At 8:08 a.m., paramedics were called to her home. She was rushed to the hospital. By the time news reached the press, Diane Keaton, America's eternal Annie Hall, was gone, 79 years old, no cause of death disclosed. Woody Allen heard the news the same way the rest of the world did, through a phone call from a mutual friend. His first words were hauntingly simple, "I didn't even know she was sick." For a man who spent his entire life analyzing every detail, that unknowing destroyed him. How could he not have known? How could he, who once saw through every mask she wore, have missed the most important one? At the funeral, small, private, attended by only a few close friends, he came quietly masked and hunched, looking every bit his 89 years. Meryl Streep later told a confidant that he cried uncontrollably, not the silent tears of regret, but full, body-shaking sobs. "It was like watching a man break apart," she said. In his hands, he held a framed photograph from 1970, the two of them laughing between takes on Play It Again, Sam. Pure joy before fame, before betrayal, before the world turned their love into legend. Days later, friends revealed that Woody had written her a letter, a long one. He never sent it. She died before he could. Inside were things he'd never said aloud: apologies, confessions, gratitude, love, regret. In that letter, he wrote, "You gave me everything, and I spent a lifetime rewriting it. I thought I could make love perfect on film. I couldn't even keep it alive in real life." That line, perhaps more than anything he ever directed, reveals the tragedy that outlived them both. Because for Woody Allen, the punishment wasn't exile or criticism. It was memory. It was knowing that the one person who truly saw him, the one who laughed when the rest of the world turned away, was gone, and the world that once applauded his genius now condemned his name. The genius, the muse, the myth, they had both become ghosts. But the mystery doesn't end there. because what Woody Allen finally confessed after her death wasn't about scandal or fame or guilt. It was about love, the kind that survives everything except time. In the quiet aftermath of Diane Keaton's death, Hollywood moved on, as it always does. But for Woody Allen, time didn't move, it stalled. The world that once revolved around premieres, scripts, and applause had narrowed into something smaller, an apartment filled with photographs, fading film reels, and ghosts. He rarely appeared in public after her funeral. Those who did see him said he'd become almost unrecognizable, slower, quieter, softer. The acerbic wit that once disarmed interviewers was replaced by a gentleness that startled even his oldest friends. "He's living inside memory now," one producer said. "He talks about Diane as if she just left the room." At 89, Woody Allen was no longer the icon, the provocateur, or the philosopher king of New York cinema. He was simply a man haunted by the shape of his own creation, the life he wrote, the woman who embodied it, and the love he could never hold on to. But even in grief, he couldn't stop writing. It was the only way he knew how to exist. Late at night, he'd sit at his desk, typewriter, humming softly, tapping out what friends called love letters disguised as scripts. Most would never be filmed. Some were about loss, others about forgiveness. All of them in some way were about her. A close friend once asked him what he missed most. He thought for a long time before answering. "Her chaos," he said. "Everything about her was unpredictable. I hated it then. I miss it now." His later interviews, what few he gave, were full of the kind of brutal honesty that had always eluded him in youth. "I spent my life trying to understand love," he told a journalist in a rare appearance. But love isn't something you understand. It's something you ruin and then regret forever. Meanwhile, the industry that had exiled him found itself conflicted. Some still condemned him. Others began to reconsider. In retrospectives, Annie Hall and Manhattan were discussed not as trophies, but as emotional archaeology, evidence of two artists who had turned their own vulnerabilities into cinematic truth. And Diane's legacy only grew stronger after her passing. Young actresses cited her as an influence, not for her perfection, but for her refusal to play by anyone's rules, not even Hollywood's. Clips of her 1970s interviews went viral again. Her awkward grace, her laugh, her refusal to pretend. In a world obsessed with image, she remained defiantly real. In one of his last known conversations, Woody Allen said something to a friend that perfectly summarized the paradox of his later years. "Diane made me funny. She made me human. Without her, I'm just a man trying to make sense of the silence." He never remarried, never attempted a public comeback. He simply faded, writing quietly, walking the same Upper East Side streets where he once dreamed of immortality. Now, all he wanted was understanding. And, sometimes late at night, neighbors reported hearing faint piano music from his apartment window, old jazz standards, the kind he and Diane used to listen to on long drives through the city. To the world, Woody Allen remains a contradiction, brilliant, broken, beloved, condemned. But to those who know this story, he is something else entirely, a man who finally understood too late that control was never love, and that real devotion often comes wrapped in rebellion. Because in the end, the woman who refused to be shaped by him became the one who defined him forever. In Hollywood, legends often fade into caricatures, frozen in time, stripped of nuance. But the legacy of Woody Allen and Diane Keaton resists simplicity. It exists not in the scandal columns or Oscar lists, but in something rarer, the unspoken connection between art, regret, and truth. For Diane Keaton, death did not end her story, it magnified it. Tributes poured in from across the industry, though they were conflicted, almost reverent in their hesitation. Some praised her brilliance, her courage, her originality. Others couldn't separate her art from her loyalty to a man the world had long condemned. Yet even her critics admitted one thing: no one ever was Diane Keaton. There had been others, imitators, homages, but never another quite like her. In film schools and retrospectives, Annie Hall is still studied, but the conversation has shifted. Professors now frame it not only as a romantic masterpiece, but as an emotional document, an archive of real people hiding inside fictional masks. Students watch it and see two artists immortalizing the very thing that was destroying them. Love, when filtered through art, becomes both confession and illusion. Woody Allen's later years remain a moral labyrinth for critics. His genius is undeniable, his controversies inescapable. Yet within that tangle lies the strange persistence of Diane Keaton's influence. Every woman he ever wrote afterward carried a shadow of her strong, erratic, gentle, impossible. As one critic wrote, Allen spent a lifetime writing different versions of the same woman, and she was always Diane. Her death transformed public perception of him more than any film ever could. The vitriol softened just slightly when people saw the frail, grieving man at her funeral clutching that photograph from 1970. Suddenly, the debate shifted from whether he deserved forgiveness to whether he had ever been capable of it. Younger audiences rediscovered Keaton through the digital afterlife of nostalgia. Clips of her interviews flooded TikTok. Her voice, light, spontaneous, disarmingly honest, felt alien in an era of polish and performance. She became once again an emblem of authenticity in an age that desperately needed it. Fashion houses began referencing her style again. The wide trousers, the ties, the bowler hats. Designers called it the Keaton Rebellion, a reminder that femininity could be powerful precisely because it didn't conform. But her truest legacy wasn't aesthetic, it was philosophical. In an industry built on illusion, Diane Keaton's greatest act was to remain real. She never chased perfection. She never apologized for contradiction. She lived and worked as though being human was more important than being adored, and in doing so, she became timeless. As for Woody Allen, his legacy became inseparable from hers. The world may remember him as a fallen icon, a genius undone by controversy, but within that narrative runs an undercurrent of something more human, his confession that every frame of greatness he ever produced came from trying and failing to love her right. In a private conversation shortly before his 90th birthday, he told a friend, "Diane gave me credibility, but more than that, she gave me clarity. Without her, I don't know who I was writing about." Their story has become a mirror held up to Hollywood itself, beauty and pain, brilliance and blindness, loyalty and loss. Two people who turned their connection into something bigger than romance, bigger than scandal, something eternal. Because in the end, their bond wasn't about perfection. It was about the unfinished symphony of two flawed artists who understood that the most haunting love stories are the ones that never find their ending, and in that haunting lies their immortality. The story of Woody Allen and Diane Keaton isn't a simple one to judge, because judgment by its very nature flattens what was always messy, human, and impossible to categorize. Hollywood loves clean narratives, heroes and villains, sinners and saints. But this isn't that kind of story. This is about contradiction, about how two people can simultaneously bring out the best and worst in each other, about how art can be both a masterpiece and a wound. To condemn Woody Allen outright is easy. To idolize him is easier still. But to look at him honestly, to see both the brilliance and the blindness, the genius and the guilt, that's harder. His films remain extraordinary works of art, but they also reveal the man's deepest flaws, the obsessive need to control, to intellectualize, to turn life into something he could script. And yet, within that need lies a strange kind of beauty, because every time he failed to understand love, he wrote another film trying to. Diane Keaton, on the other hand, represents the opposite force, the free spirit that refuses to be caged. She didn't dissect feelings, she lived them. She wasn't interested in logic or legacy. She was interested in truth, even when it hurt her, even when it cost her everything. Her loyalty to Allen remains one of the most polarizing acts of her life. Was it admirable or misguided? Was it blind faith or brave defiance? Perhaps it was all of it at once, because love in its truest form often looks irrational from the outside. She saw something in him that the world no longer wanted to see: humanity. And that perhaps is the tragedy beneath the tragedy, that the very qualities that made her beloved on screen made her condemned off it. Allen's late life confessions, quietly shared among friends, aren't redemption. They're recognition. A man finally realizing that the masterpiece was never the film, it was the woman he tried to rewrite and could never improve. There's a painful irony in that. The man who built his career on clever dialogue finally understood that words were never enough, and the woman who once stumbled through her lines on stage became his purest truth. Their story is not a warning nor a love letter. It's a mirror. It shows us what happens when art becomes the language of love, and when love becomes the price of art. It asks us to consider how we separate the creator from the creation, and whether doing so is even possible. Because when you strip away the fame, the controversy, the decades of mythology, what remains are two souls who couldn't stop orbiting each other even when the world demanded they part. Diane Keaton once said, "I don't regret any of it." And maybe that's the final wisdom here. Regret belongs to those who can't accept imperfection. Love, the real kind, belongs to those who embrace it anyway. In the end, Woody and Diane remind us that the greatest stories are never tidy, they're true. There's a photograph that outlived them both, taken on the set of Play It Again, Sam, 1970. Two young dreamers caught mid-laughter, eyes crinkled, unaware that they were being watched. No glamour, no posing, just the rare kind of joy that can't be performed. That photograph has since made its way across the internet, captioned simply, "Before they became icons." Looking at it now feels almost sacred, because that's who they really were before Hollywood sculpted them into symbols and history turned them into arguments. A man terrified of emotion and a woman who lived by it, a control freak and a free spirit. Two halves of an equation that never balanced yet, somehow kept adding up to something unforgettable. For decades they tried to define what they were: lovers, friends, collaborators, myth. None of it ever fit. But maybe that's the point. Maybe some relationships are too intricate for labels, too enduring for closure. Diane Keaton never stopped believing in Woody Allen, and Woody Allen never stopped being haunted by Diane Keaton. Their connection was a language that only they spoke, a secret melody the rest of the world could only overhear. It's tempting to imagine him now in that small New York apartment, typing out one last story at his old desk, the keys clicking softly, the light dim, the city humming outside. Perhaps he's writing about her again, or perhaps he's just writing to her the way he always did, through characters, through memory, through film. He once said, "Love is too complicated to make sense of, but too important to ignore." Maybe that's all this was: a lifelong conversation between two people who never stopped trying to understand each other, even when understanding wasn't possible. And maybe that's what makes their story so haunting. It isn't tragic because it ended. It's tragic because it never really did. In the long history of Hollywood, their names will forever be entwined, not as a scandal, not as a romance, but as proof that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about happy endings. They're about the ache of unfinished ones. Diane Keaton taught us to find beauty in chaos. Woody Allen taught us that genius and guilt often share the same heartbeat. Together they left us with something that art rarely captures anymore: the truth of being human, flawed, loyal, desperate to connect, and forever learning too late. Some stories fade with time. Theirs lingers softly, stubbornly, like a melody you can't forget. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now you know.